Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. 30 years ago last weekend, Hurricane Hugo made direct landfall on the state of South Carolina, forever changing the landscape. Since then, stronger hurricanes fueled by warming seas continue to pose a threat to our state. And just this week, the United Nations released a climate change report with a bleak outcome for the world's oceans and future storms. This week, the United Nations General Assembly convened, and the Climate Action Summit was held following days of worldwide marches from millions of people who wanted to see action from their leaders on reducing climate change. The movement gained major momentum thanks to Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old Swedish activist.
People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
The United States did not participate in the UN Climate Action Summit and has backed away from the Paris Climate Accord, the agreement 194 other countries signed on to in 2015 to reduce carbon emissions in an effort to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Despite limited action amid a drastic new climate report detailing the effects of a warming planet and sea level rise, South Carolinians want to see change. According to a Winthrop poll conducted in March, 79% of respondents said they think state leaders should take action to combat climate change effects, such as flooding from rising sea levels. Recent strong hurricanes have pummeled coastal South Carolina, with storm surge and flooding that has extended well inland, leaving death and destruction in its wake. Those flooding concerns prompted the governor to create the Floodwater Commission in 2018 to mitigate future problems from storms, though many say more needs to be done. Joining us to discuss climate change are Dr. Ziolkowski, an associate professor in the USC School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment, and Alan Hancock, the Energy and Climate Advocacy Director, the South Carolina Coastal Conservation League. Thank you all for joining us.
No problem. Thank you.
Lori, kind of lead us off talking about what we're seeing with climate change. What's the baseline here? What do we mean when we talk about climate change, and what's causing this, and what we're seeing right now?
So climate change in general is like the long-term what you expect, what you're going to see with temperatures. Just like we know that we're currently in fall, we should be having cooler temperatures. We're not really experiencing that right now. We're still in the summertime temperatures. And that is something that will be continuing to happening. There's rising global temperatures, and we call it climate change because some places are getting cooler while the overall signal is warmer for the whole world. And so it's expected that this is going to continue to increase the temperatures because carbon emissions are really what is driving this, and that those aren't slowing down globally. And so as we add more CO2 to the atmosphere, we're continuing to basically warm up the planet.
Is it becoming a challenge to really kind of get that message out to people these days, to kind of get a clear message? I mean, I know sometimes it gets mumbled, and we have a lot of political movement here, but that's what's happening.
So I think the political part of it is really what's limiting our action at this moment, because there's been studies that have looked at the partisanship in terms of climate change, and really it's your political affiliation more than your education, your sex, or anything else that has your sway on climate change and understanding the science and listening to the science. And right now there's been a lot of rhetoric about one side of the story coming from certain political affiliations.
Again, you have just kind of like a little overview right there. We don't want to paint anyone one way or the other, but again, we did see a big report come out this week from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issue report that says sea levels are supposed to rise by 3.6 feet by the end of the century. This is a revised number, up about 12%. It's not encouraging to see these numbers going up. What's the reaction when you see that happening, Lori?
Very troubling. We know that here in Columbia, we get the people who are evacuating from the hurricanes. But right now, the difference between regular floods, like a sort of regular water levels and flood stage, is 2.5 feet or 2 feet or something like that for downtown Charleston. So if we're going to be seeing 3.5 feet for the sea level rise by the end of the century, that means consistent flooding that will only get worse during storms. And so that means that there's going to be an influx of people who are going to be moving from the coast inland because it will no longer be habitable. What will that mean for the economy?
So many things interconnected with climate change, and we just think, oh, it's warm, it's September, but there are so many moving parts. And now another part of that report showed that by 2050, several major coastal cities like Savannah and Miami will be seeing 100-year floods happening every year. I can't imagine that Charleston or Myrtle Beach, the Grand Strand, is too far behind that either. What does that mean for our coast, which is such a moneymaker, obviously, when we look at tourism and also development?
That's right. This week's report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was a wake-up call. We need to act to both reduce emissions of carbon pollution into the atmosphere, but we also need to adapt and build a healthier, more resilient coastline. Our executive director, Laura Cantrell of the Coastal Conservation League, had a piece in the Post and Courier this week that lays out things that we can do. Not build in floodplains, not encourage new development with infrastructure in flood-prone areas, sea islands, for example, like Johns Island. Those are things we can do to make sure that we're not putting ourselves at additional risk from sea level rise.
So do we have to get incentives on the board here to kind of get people away from saying, look at this great piece of land, maybe it floods every now and then, but it's still a great piece to put 50 homes or something like that? How do you kind of really get the buy-in to help prevent that kind of development that's fueling this?
It's a big question. It deals with both local, state, and national issues. On the federal level, our flood insurance program provides incentives for folks to build in floodplains. At the state level, Governor Henry McMaster convened a floodwater commission to study things that state and local governments can do. And individual cities and counties make zoning and transportation decisions that affects whether or not we build in wetlands along South Carolina's coast.
And so it's kind of disconcerting to see that kind of movement still in Charleston, when we see these places still being built up and overpopulated. I mean, we do see that Charleston is doing some proactive steps here, Alan, but are they doing enough in Coastal Conservation League's opinion?
I don't think so. There's much more that could be done. A grassroots group, Fix Flooding First, hosted a mayoral campaign roundtable, a forum last week in Charleston, and a lot of the candidates had some interesting ideas on what we can do. Unfortunately, many of the new infrastructure projects necessary to make Charleston more healthy, more resilient, require billions of dollars of investment. So that means South Carolina should focus on those projects that make the most difference and not spending billions of dollars on, say, highway projects that would encourage coastal development in more vulnerable parts of our coast.
And Dr. Z, which I know it's an easy way of saying Ziolkowski, I want to jump back to you really quick about the climate change report that we saw from the UN. There was discussion about, even if we did get everyone down to zero, net emissions right now, today, there'd still be an increase of about 0.5 degrees Celsius over the next 2-3 decades. But last year was a record year for carbon emissions, and the biggest emitters, the US, China, India, aren't really slowing down. So what do we say when we see this and there are such big drivers still influencing these problems?
I think that we really have to think about who's paying for the damages, because we are effectively all paying for the damages right now because we're all putting the carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And yet the companies are making lots of money off of selling us these things. We're complicit too in some ways by using it. So could we have some way to recover the costs? And so this is where carbon pricing often gets into the conversation, because we need some way to make it so there's an incentive to not emit as much. And right now there's no incentive to stop. We also have to think about that. There's a lot of talk about who's doing the most emitting, and there's a lot of finger pointing to China right now, but if we look at per capita emissions, so each person, a single American is emitting about the equivalent of 2 Chinese people. And so while China as a whole country might be close or more than what we are emitting, we have to think about, are they equal by the person standpoint? And so we have to basically start thinking about how are we generating our energy, and could we do better? Could we be moving to more renewables, more solar, more wind, and continuing to build the nuclear plants, essentially? And so thinking about ways to not necessarily have fossil fuels as how we're driving everything.
And I mean, when we talk about our output, how can people maybe limit their output for carbon emissions if you were to be so inclined as watching?
There are things that people can do, but I would say the number one thing that people can do that would be the most impactful is to vote with climate policies in mind. Because I think that having individuals take the burden will make it unfair in some ways. People can drive less, people can think about what they're consuming in terms of buying local, maybe not eating as much meat, because that also has a heavy carbon footprint. And so just thinking about how they're consuming, not flying as much, it's kind of hard in some ways to take about some of the fun out of life. But another way, we have to think about how can we make structural change, and it's really only with policy that we can make large-scale structural change, and that's going to take political action.
Speaking of political action now, and I'll let you weigh in on the politics a little bit more,
Yeah.
sure, just for Lori's sake. We didn't really see much political action this week at the UN, specifically from the United States. There was a UN Climate Action Summit. The U.S. was invited. The U.S. didn't attend. The president did stop by, glanced in, said a couple things, I think, to Michael Bloomberg, who's an envoy up there about it. And he mentioned back, whenever you get your climate change policy in place, we can actually do this. But I mean, we don't really have any real direction from the federal government at this point when it comes to climate change. In fact, they're rolling back some standards that have been previously enacted.
The direction from the federal government right now is more oil, more fracked gas, and no consideration of the long-term impacts of our changing climate. Fortunately, state leaders are acting. And so much of what we can do to reduce the emissions from utilities and transportation sectors is at the state and local level. For example, Governor Henry McMaster signed the Energy Freedom Act, the big solar bill that passed earlier this year. And that removed a lot of the barriers to the growth of solar in South Carolina. Local leaders as well can also make a difference. So when you're voting, while thinking of climate in mind, that's true at the local, state, and federal levels. Zoning decisions, land use decisions, things that mayors Benjamin and Tecklenburg in Columbia and Charleston, respectively, have made made climate change a priority. They've committed to aggressive climate change goals, and I think that's a real opportunity for those mayors to live up to the goals that they've pledged to meet.
And when we look at the 2015 Paris Climate Accord, which the U.S. is not really a part of anymore, 195 other countries did sign on to that. And Lori, I don't want you to weigh in on the politics of it, but with the whole goal of that was to kind of keep the world, to cut carbon emissions and also keep the world from warming up by 2 degrees Celsius. What happens, if you can maybe speak to the climate aspect of this, when we start going to places like 2 degrees Celsius, which is, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit? What happens to our climate when we start warming by 1, 2, 3 degrees Celsius?
So the most obvious will be longer summers, hotter days, more extreme days in terms of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, etc. And so this will mean more drought. It's problems for agriculture and food scarcity might be a problem for some, and water resources, just in terms of globally. But here, we think about it in terms of the long-term heating, and so more air conditioning will be required, which is going to be a bigger energy drain on the system. But why the scientists were really concerned about 2 degrees is because it will mean that there's going to be tipping points in the system, and so we're really concerned about what's going to happen with Greenland. And so there's about 75 feet of ice equivalent for sea level rise on Greenland, and as that starts melting more, it's going to reach a point where it's no longer going to be staying as ice, and it's going to be melting faster, and we might not be able to recover it. We're also worried about what could happen with Antarctica, because together Greenland and Antarctica are the equivalent of about 200 feet of sea level rise, which would make Columbia, seafront property, if both of them melted. It's not going to happen before the end of the century. No, it is not going to happen before the end of the century. It will be centuries away if that ever happens. However, just to give you context about what does that mean if those 2 ice sheets melt, and that's pretty phenomenal. We're also worried about what will happen with permafrost. The Arctic seems very far away, but it's warming faster than any other part of the world. And there's twice as much carbon stored in the soil in the permafrost as there is in the atmosphere today. And microbes might start chewing on that carbon and basically causing more carbon emissions. There's a bunch of things that are feedback loops or extra emphasis that will start happening once we get past 2 degrees.
Well, we just saw that funeral for a glacier too, right, recently? Right. I mean, that's kind of the state of things right now. But when we kind of zero in on South Carolina, we do see these stronger storms. And NOAA said last year that there were 14 weather and climate events in the country that caused 247 deaths, some $91 billion in damages. So you start putting people's lives with it direct and also damages. And again, that's from climate events. I'm not saying that's all because of global warming, but again, there are connections to these storms like we saw with Hurricane Florence, and that did kind of show the level of what flooding can do to South Carolina. So is that, again, more of a wake-up call when we see these numbers, Alan, when we see price tags and deaths associated with these storms?
It absolutely is. And I think South Carolinians are responding. Just last week with the climate strike event in Charleston, at the College of Charleston, we saw hundreds of folks coming out to talk about the need to act. We had an event here in Columbia at the State House as a part of those climate strike protests. Just this week in Charleston, my organization, Coastal Conservation League, hosted an event with leading scholars on what we can do about sea level rise, and hundreds of people came to a weeknight lecture. That says to me that folks care in South Carolina, and not just based on anecdotes. I think we've seen recent Winthrop poll evidence that South Carolinians understand that this is a problem. And there are also some studies from Yale and the Yale Center on Climate Change Communication that show that South Carolinians appreciate that this is an issue.
Dr. Z, when we see millions of people turning out, we had hundreds here in the state, is that encouraging to see maybe people are at least getting involved or at least paying attention and being aware? I mean, you were talking to me about how your students, when you kind of bring up climate change, is it gets a little dire for some people, especially this younger generation.
Yeah.
What's that mood like when you talk to students about climate change and the possibility for these changes?
It's tough. Basically, we talk about how the current infrastructure is making life for them challenging in the future. And so that's a challenging concept. I just want to go back for a second and think about it. This isn't just about sea level rise and what's going to happen at the coast. With the flooding that happened last year in the Midwest, some of that flooding also flooded Central Command. And so this is an important issue for military. So there was a hurricane that hit the Panhandle, and that hit an Air Force base, but the Central Command was also flooded. So this is for the military also a great concern. It's a threat multiplier for them. And so this is something that we also need to be thinking about in terms of what will that mean for, I know I'm studying from the science, but I think it's really important that we look at where all the impacts are, and it's not just coastal.
But your students are also worried about this. I mean, we hear from I've been hearing reports recently about students, younger generation having anxiety over climate change and worry about climate change. I'm just wondering if you're hearing the same kind of concerns from your students.
So I teach a semester-long class on climate change, and I would not say that it's most uplifting class, and in the middle it's quite depressing, and then we start talking about some solutions, and then they get quite anxious because we also talk about solutions on how to engineer a better climate, and then they're like, that's just messing things up more. And so they want to actually do the policy changes, but it gets challenging, and sometimes they leave my class not wanting to have children.
We're not advocating one way or the other for that. But Alan, we did talk about national security concerns about this, and the governor's floodwater commission, which was convened last year because of Hurricane Florence and the flooding, didn't directly reference climate change in its initial report, its initial findings this year. But they do talk about that DoD report, which says that climate change is a national security risk. So, I'm wondering if South Carolina needs to take it more seriously. Obviously, they are trying to make some changes, but to make it more of an issue when it is national security or if it is economic development. Because it seems like once we put economic development in front of something like education, it becomes a top priority in a way. Is that what needs to be done in South Carolina?
I think the Floodwater Commission that the governor led is a great start. It was a good effort to come up with ways to make our coast more healthy and more resilient. I look forward to reading the full report. The governor's office has, from what I understand, released just sort of an overview for public comment. And before the public has an opportunity to really comment and weigh in, the governor's office should release the full report so that we know some of the science and policy issues that informed some of the decisions in that summary document. And with respect to the question of if the state should have an overarching climate plan, yes, I think every city, state, company, organization should have a plan on dealing with our changing climate. We've seen in North Carolina, Governor Roy Cooper, with his Executive Order 80 that set up a climate action plan, that really set into motion the wheels of state government to address climate change in a large sense. That's not to say that we're not acting in South Carolina. The Energy Freedom Act, I think, does a great job of getting obstacles to solar out of the way. Additionally, with the sale of Santee Cooper, or the potential sale, of Santee Cooper coming up next year, that's an opportunity to close some of the coal plants in our coastal plain that put out millions of tons of carbon pollution a year. A recent study from Synapse Energy Economics showed that solar, energy efficiency, and closing those coal plants would be the least cost option for Santee Cooper's customers. So I think when solar and energy efficiency are the cheapest way for Santee Cooper customers and South Carolinians more broadly to meet their energy needs reliably, I think that says that acting to reduce carbon emissions is also good economics. It's good for jobs. It's good for working families that don't want to spend any more of their paychecks on power bills.
I do want to go back to kind of our energy mix in a minute, but
yeah.
I want to talk to you, Dr. Z, about, SCDNR put out their own report, I think in 2013, about the effects of climate change on South Carolina. And some of the findings specific to the state would be increased heat waves, more frequent and prolonged droughts, which part of the state's in right now, increased frequency of wildfires, which is something the West is dealing with, we occasionally have in South Carolina, and more extreme flood events. So troubling to hear that, but again, do you think, I mean, that's been out there since 2013, and I'm wondering, have you heard or seen much action outside of the Floodwater Commission that we're talking about, which is a recent development, to kind of spur movement to really start dealing with mitigating these efforts?
Not really. Yeah. But we also have to remember, we can as a state or as a local community start making action, but the atmosphere mixes very quickly. So this is not just something that we can fix in our little own area and we won't be impacted by what's happening globally. And so this is something that collectively we all need to work on. And this is why things like the Paris Agreement are really important. But I think we also need to be focusing on how to make these climate agreements more legally binding. And part of the reason why Paris wasn't legally binding was a U.S. resolution that happened in the Senate. I think it was 95, the Byrd-Hagel, which 95-0 was voted that we will never have a climate agreement that is legally binding in the U.S. if it harms the U.S. economy or if developing countries won't do the same as us. And I think so we're putting economics in front of everything, and that is what Greta Thunberg pointed out this week, is that we're putting economics ahead of everything, and at what cost?
And we're seeing more of a shift, obviously, with the Democrats, and we're hearing from the Democratic 2020 presidential candidates really laying out these big plans. Bernie Sanders with a $16 trillion plan. So it seems like that tone is shifting. I'm wondering if that vote would be different these days, or if we're maybe shifting that mindset to make it an economic driver, essentially, because if the future depends on our viability in certain situations, and if we're becoming more volatile in situations, then economics is a pretty big driver, all of that. But Alan, I want to talk really quick with 5 minutes left about how local level things are happening. Charleston's a good example of being, I don't want to say proactive because they're still kind of being reactive, but they are doing something to kind of mitigate the threat. They're a huge tunnel under September P. Clark Parkway. They're looking to raise up the battery up down there. And I'm just wondering, is that enough in a sense, or is this still just kind of baby steps that are happening in South Carolina?
I think Charleston is, like with Miami, New York, other coastal cities, a real poster child for what can happen with sea level rise and climate change. Mayor Tecklenburg and Mayor Riley before him took the threat seriously in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say that those infrastructure projects, those very expensive infrastructure projects, are baby steps, but we absolutely can do more. I think that's an issue in the mayor's race in Charleston. We've seen proposals from some candidates. We've seen some that could theoretically make flooding worse in Charleston. But I think you're right. Charleston is definitely a place where we see this the impacts of climate change happening.
And their floodwater and sea level rise report also said that they want to see buildings and critical infrastructure be built up by 3 feet, and that was an increase from their previous report too. So it's fascinating to see these movements. Dr. Z, just kind of looking forward, I mean, we haven't seen too much direct action outside the legislature, and I'm wondering, is there anything that you think that maybe lawmakers come back in January could start looking into doing to help kind of maybe mitigate or make it easier for these cities and municipalities to help combat some of these issues? I
think that thinking about how we emit, so can we do better with public transportation? Can we do better with how we are doing our energy mix? And so facilitating move to renewables, I think, would be really helpful, because having a way in which we emit in total for the state can make a difference. And so I think better infrastructure for public transportation and renewables is really important.
And Alan, just kind of wrapping up too, we did see that bill S217, a Senate bill kind of moved from the Senate to the House really quick last year, and that would help municipalities like Charleston get some of that hospitality and accommodations tax to put towards these infrastructure needs. Is that what needs to be done? Is that what maybe a big issue y'all are pushing next year in the State House?
The Coastal Conservation League is absolutely focused on how we can make our coast more resilient. And that bill and other legislative efforts to increase funding for resilience, whether it's buying out properties that flood repeatedly, whether it's new infrastructure, the larger questions that Professor Z raised on public transportation and making our current infrastructure more resilient. I think all of those should be legislative priorities.
So what we're saying is there's still plenty more that needs to be done in South Carolina and elsewhere for that matter.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks to Lori, thanks to Alan, and thank you for joining us. Also, check out the South Carolina Lead. It's a political podcast that can be found on your podcast app on any mobile device. Each week, I recap the weekly political news with the reporters who cover it. From the Kennedy Greenhouse Studio on the campus of the University of South Carolina, I'm Gavin Jackson.